October 1492. A man returns to Spain with wild tales of adventure, stolen treasure, and something completely unexpected: a hammock. His name, Christopher Columbus, and he's about to set off a chain of events that will reshape the entire world. Fast forward 3 centuries, and 13 British colonies are about to do something absolutely insane: declare war on the most powerful empire on Earth. This is the story of how a ragtag group of farmers, merchants, and lawyers took on the British crown and somehow didn't get completely destroyed in the process. Well, at least not immediately. Buckle up, because we're diving into the American Revolution.
Welcome to Explained Simply channel, where complex topics become crystal clear and easy to understand.
When Columbus landed in Central America, he went on what can only be described as an enthusiastic crime spree, stealing gold, jewelry, people, and yes, that hammock. He returned to Spain with exotic goods nobody in Europe had seen before: tobacco, pineapples, turkeys. And did we mention the hammock? Now, technically, Leif Erikson and the Vikings reached America first in the 11th century, but they didn't tell anyone about it, so Columbus gets the credit for starting the scramble for the New World. For the next 2 centuries, European powers fought brutal wars with Native Americans and each other, carving up the continent. By the mid-1700s, both England and France claimed the same territory in North America. The French decided to build forts there. The English said, "Could you not?" The French said, "No, we could not," and built them anyway. The British sent a young officer named George Washington with troops to deal with the situation. After a brief skirmish where a French commander surrendered, someone split the Frenchman's head open with a tomahawk. This sparked a 7-year global conflict that Britain eventually won. But victory wasn't cheap. It cost them £60 million. Britain was now completely broke and needed money desperately. They looked at the American colonies and thought, "We just spent a fortune protecting you from the French, so how about you help pay for it?" The colonists replied, "No," so Britain said, "Fine, we'll just tax you then." In 1764, the Sugar Act forced colonists to buy sugar and molasses exclusively from Britain and pay duties on them. Then came the notorious Stamp Act of 1765. Suddenly, every paper document, pamphlet, and even playing card required a tax stamp. The colonists were furious. They'd enjoyed ruling themselves for years, and now Britain was tightening control. Worse yet, they had no representatives in Parliament making these tax decisions. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. Protests erupted everywhere. Fiery speeches condemned the taxes. British goods were boycotted. Loyalists faced harassment. The protests worked. British businesses suffered so badly that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act after just 2 years. But Britain still desperately needed money. Their solution? More taxes. The Townshend Acts of 1767 added import duties on glass, lead, paper, tea, and paint. Once again, Americans boycotted. Once again, British business felt the pain. Once again, Britain backed down. Except they kept the tax on tea as a symbol of authority. King George III then sent 1,000 troops to occupy Boston, with colonists forced to pay for them. Tension in the city became unbearable. On March 5, 1770, it exploded. Patriots began heckling a British guard. More colonists joined in. More soldiers arrived. Snowballs were thrown, then rocks, then oyster shells. The outnumbered soldiers panicked. Shots rang out. 5 civilians died. The Boston Massacre became powerful propaganda. The British were portrayed as murderous tyrants. Anger spread like wildfire. When a British revenue ship ran aground in Rhode Island, locals burned it. When Massachusetts governor supported British policies, colonists burned his house. Then came the big one. On December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans, boarded a British merchant ship in Boston Harbor, and dumped 10,000 pounds worth of tea into the water. Britain's response was brutal. They dissolved Massachusetts' government, revoked their charter, and sent 3,000 more troops to occupy Boston. The city was now under direct British rule. The other colonies watched nervously, fearing they'd be next. So they organized a meeting. The First Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia with 56 delegates from 12 colonies. The attendees read like America's greatest hits: John Adams, John Jay, George Washington, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and John Dickinson. Later, names like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton would join them. After heated debate, they reached a brilliant solution. They'd simply ask Britain to stop. Britain's response: no, so Congress told local militias to arm themselves and prepare for action. The Minutemen were born, citizen soldiers ready to fight at a moment's notice. When your colonies start openly arming themselves, you know things are getting serious. British General Thomas Gage ordered 700 troops to march from Boston into the Massachusetts countryside to destroy rebel weapons stockpiled in Concord. The British moved at night, but patriots like Paul Revere rode ahead, warning that the Redcoats were coming. The two forces met in Lexington at sunrise on April 19, 1775. They faced each other in tense silence. Then, in the confusion, someone fired. That single shot, the shot heard around the world, marked the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. The outnumbered rebels fell back to Concord as British troops split up searching for weapons. But more and more patriot militiamen kept arriving. Now the British were outnumbered. Fighting erupted in Concord, and the world's most professional army was forced to flee back to Boston, chased by poorly trained local farmers with muskets. All along the retreat route, more rebels gathered to fire on the British. When the exhausted Redcoats finally reached Boston, they found themselves surrounded and under siege. Meanwhile, in upstate New York, Colonel Benedict Arnold hatched a plan to capture Fort Ticonderoga, which held massive stores of guns and ammunition. He set off alone, hoping to recruit men along the way. He encountered the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, who had the exact same plan. They agreed to work together, then immediately started arguing over who was in charge. This went on so long that the Green Mountain Boys threatened to leave, forcing Arnold to back down. They raided the fort at night, catching the sleeping British completely by surprise and capturing it with almost no resistance. It was a huge victory, though Arnold felt he didn't get proper credit. Nobody was quite sure what was happening anymore. The colonies were in open rebellion and somehow winning. King George fired General Gage, replaced him with General William Howe, and ordered the rebellion crushed immediately. The Continental Congress realized they needed a proper army, so they appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. Washington acted humble about it, but let's be real. He'd been showing up to Congress in his military uniform every single day for 10 months. Everyone knew he wanted the job. Washington headed to Boston to take command just as the British made their first major move to break the siege. The British planned to take the high ground on Bunker Hill, but spies warned the Continentals. American forces fortified Bunker Hill and set up positions on nearby Breed's Hill. When battle came, Continental gunfire rained down on advancing British troops. Twice the British tried to take the hill. Twice they were pushed back. After 3 hours, the Americans finally ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, giving the British a technical victory. But it cost them nearly 1,000 casualties compared to just 400 American losses. The colonists had proven this wasn't just a rebellion. It was a real war. But here's the thing. Most colonists still weren't sure why they were fighting. While some radicals whispered about independence, most hoped to eventually make peace with Britain. Congress sent a letter to King George, basically saying, "Hey, things aren't going great. How about you remove the taxes and we're friends again?" The king's response was essentially, "I'm going to kick your ass." When the poorly written letter arrived in America, patriots tried to decipher his terrible handwriting. It definitely wasn't friendly. Small battles continued throughout the year. The British burned Falmouth, Massachusetts, and Norfolk, Virginia as revenge for anti-British actions. These brutal tactics played perfectly into patriot propaganda. The British looked like monsters, and France and Spain quietly began sending supplies to the rebels. Benedict Arnold, still hungry for personal glory, led an ambitious two-pronged invasion of Canada. The Continentals captured some British forts and even took Montreal. But a harsh snowstorm combined with a smallpox outbreak defeated them at Quebec City, forcing a long retreat back to Fort Ticonderoga. Remember all those guns and ammunition captured at Fort Ticonderoga? A man named Henry Knox had a brilliant and completely insane plan. He used oxen to drag 120,000 pounds of artillery through harsh winter conditions for 2 months across 300 miles all the way to Washington's army outside Boston. Washington now had serious firepower, perfect timing, since his freezing army had been wondering how long this siege would last. Washington wanted to launch a full assault on Boston, but his officers convinced him the British were too well fortified. Instead, the Continentals worked through the night, setting up the massive guns on Dorchester Heights overlooking the city. When dawn broke and the British saw the artillery aimed down at them, they knew it was over. Their positions were completely exposed, checkmate. They had no choice but to evacuate. 120 ships carried 9,000 redcoats and 2,000 loyalists away to an uncertain fate. Washington had won his first major victory. Washington moved his army to New York, correctly predicting that's where the British would strike next. Meanwhile, an unassuming writer named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense that advocated for complete independence from Britain. It spread like wildfire, and remains the best-selling title in American history. It was read aloud in taverns and town halls. Bringing the idea of independence into mainstream conversation, Congress began seriously considering the unthinkable. Thomas Jefferson was chosen to draft an official Declaration of Independence. He went hard, writing that all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights, conveniently ignoring that he personally owned over 100 enslaved people. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted unanimously for independence. John Adams declared that July 2 would be the most memorable day in American history. Then, a couple days later, on July 4th, independence officially took effect. The United States of America was born. There was no turning back now. Americans tore down a statue of King George in New York and melted it into 42,000 musket balls. To the British, this was treason, and the penalty for treason was hanging. Speaking of the British, guess who's back? The king sent an intimidating force of 130 warships and 25,000 troops to New York. Washington knew fighting the world's most powerful military wouldn't be easy. The British camped on Staten Island, while Americans dug defensive positions around Brooklyn Heights, waiting for the attack. But the British just waited. They were wearing down American nerves while building their strength. At one point, they launched a massive artillery barrage and basically said, "You know, if I were you, I'd probably surrender right about now." Washington told them to shove it. When the British finally attacked, they hit with overwhelming force. 15,000 troops approached American positions, and the two armies fired at each other in massive volleys. But the Americans didn't realize they were only fighting a decoy. The main British force was circling around to attack from behind. When that surprise flanking force struck, it inflicted devastating casualties. Americans panicked and retreated to Brooklyn Heights, where they found themselves trapped between the British army and the river. The war looked lost, but instead of finishing them off, the British decided to dig in for a siege. Then a miraculous thick fog rolled in, allowing Washington's entire army to escape across the river undetected. The British continued pursuing and engaging the Americans throughout Manhattan. The Americans suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. It was an absolute disaster. Washington's leadership was questioned. Thousands of American POWs were captured and left to rot in brutal conditions. Washington's battered army fled through New Jersey all the way down to Pennsylvania. Rarely had an army been so thoroughly beaten, yet somehow survived to keep fighting. Morale was at rock bottom. Soldiers were deserting. The Continental Army was falling apart. Many thought the revolution was over before it really began. The British controlled New York. They controlled much of New Jersey. Winter was setting in. The cause of American independence looked hopeless. But George Washington wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Because when things looked darkest, when defeat seemed inevitable, Washington was about to pull off one of the most daring military moves in history. A move that would change everything and prove that this revolution was far from over. But that's a story for another time. The first year of the American Revolution had been a roller coaster, from the shocking victory at Boston to the catastrophic defeats in New York. The colonists had declared their independence and melted down a king's statue to make ammunition. They'd proven they could fight, but could they actually win? 13 colonies with no navy, no professional army, and no money were taking on the British Empire at the height of its power. The odds were impossible. The stakes were life and death, literally, since losing meant hanging for treason. Yet somehow, against all logic, the revolution continued. Farmers and merchants faced off against the world's greatest military machine. And whether through luck, determination, or sheer stubborn refusal to quit, the Americans kept fighting. This was no longer just a tax dispute or a political disagreement. This was a full-scale war for the very idea that people could govern themselves, that kings weren't chosen by God, and that freedom was worth dying for. The American Revolution had truly begun, and the world would never be the same.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next video.